events, whatever people take me to do.
And I'm Emily Finke. I am a museum educator who is currently without a museum. I am a freelance science blogger, communicator, telling people about penguins and bars, that kind of thing.
This session is all about, we really want to sort of crowdsource a lot of information with everybody here to really understand how we get to know our audiences better and finding those audiences that we're missing. I think there's a key component to online communication is that it's a broadcast spawn kind of a strategy. We put something on the internet and then we tell the world that it's there. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to come and read about what you write. So some people have some really good strategies for trying to find those niche audiences that are out there and target that. Should we take a targeting approach to finding new audiences? So that's sort of what we want to sort of discuss in this session. So I think we started off with just getting your idea of what is an audience or who is an audience. Any ideas?
Can we ask our audience?
Yeah.
Well, I teach journalism, so I usually tell students it's communities of interest, either geographically or if they all share some common interest in something. Mm-hmm. That's one place to start.
Communities of interest.
Or a place. Okay,
but so that's a good segue to you have communities of interest of people that are already interested. So where do we find the people who aren't interested?
And how do we get those people who aren't interested to realize that they really are interested? They just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think in the online world, there's maybe a distinction or semantics between an audience and a community. People who are there just for a quick read versus the people who really want to engage in a discussion and a conversation, and that can sometimes be different groups of people. So figuring out which of those you're trying to target or build.
Any other comments? So that's really interesting to make that differentiation between a community and an audience. I've sort of always kind of viewed them as similar. So when I think about where I want to target writing, I think about the different types of audiences, and I break them down into sort of demographics. And I don't know if that's a useful approach of going about it. Say, I'm missing in my writing. I'm missing a lot of minorities, and I'm missing, but I'm pretty good on the male to female ratio, And so and of course, we can talk about how I know that, which is surveying the audience. And I was giving a panel at a Sonic event in New York City, and I was really surprised. I just basically asked everybody, do you ever survey your audience? Do you ever just see who it is that's reading you? And of course, surveys are always biased. They're not scientific. But you can still get a lot of really useful information. Anybody here ever surveyed their audience? Anybody that's ever surveyed the audience, not with a sort of popular science magazine or David? What kind of information do you find? What do you do from a PR perspective?
Yeah, we have I work for a global PR firm, and we have a research arm that does opinion polls for every segment of the country. So every language you can think about. We tend to break it down in either ideological, conservative, liberal, Republicans, Democrats, consumers, that sort of thing. You name it, we'll poll it.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of quantitative sort of information do you get?
The types of things that we'll do since we do PR is we'll establish a baseline. How do you feel about a particular topic or a particular brand or a particular company or a particular issue? And then if you do the following information, would that change your opinion? How much? That sort of thing. And then from that polling, we'll devise an intervention of some kind of an outreach strategy, and then we'll take another poll and see if we can do it all.
Interesting. So there's a lot of tools that are available, I think, to to someone in your position for this type of analysis. But I think for most people that are independent bloggers, there's sorts of a different variety of metrics that you can use to figure out what your audience is and where you're reaching out. Surveys I think are very important. I think more people really need to do survey their audience. Some of the information we found out when we surveyed Deep Sea News was that nobody ever comments on our blog. You know, there's always been a concern, like, are people reading? Do they care? Is that why they don't comment? Or are we just that good of explainers that they don't answer? I like to think that. But we learned from the survey is that a lot of people fell into sort of like three camps about why they don't comment. One's that they just never comment on blogs. It's just a kind of a blanket policy. It's just they don't do that. The other ones felt that they didn't have anything to add or contribute to the discussions ever, and then the other one thought that we were like a news source, or more or less. So, Deep Sea News.
Do you actually, versus your traffic numbers, know what percentage of people who read actually comment?
That's a good question. I could do that calculation, but I haven't done that. That's a good. So what would that tell you, though?
That would just tell you, some sense of how large your audience is versus the number of people you're hearing from.
Yeah, so we have a sort of, you can break it out into sort of, there's engagement factor on your blog, and then there's the sort of sharing factor, right? And for me, actually, I'm really interested in the sharing factor.
I'm much more interested in the sharing factor. Coming from a museum background, commenting, people will come up to me after a program and say, hey, that was great, and walk away. Know nothing about what they really thought about it. However, when I hear someone else is telling someone else or taking the time to send a note to up our hierarchy or send another scout program to us, it's more of a social, I think it's a more of a useful measure, knowing that people are saying, hey, this was worthwhile enough that I want to show you. And social media, I find it much more useful for my blog particularly, but I look at how people are sharing things and what they're saying about in Facebook, in Twitter, in Google Plus, rather than looking at what they're commenting on their blog.
Yeah.
Could we get a feel from the room? Do people getting any comments?
Yeah. Anybody? What's your sort of feel for comments on your articles or blogs?
I only seem to get comments when somebody's outraged.
Something's wrong.
I know there are a lot of people reading, but most of them don't bother saying, hey, this was great.
Yeah. That's an interesting problem, too, or not really a problem, but like you have a lot of sharing of the articles, there's a lot of hits or traffic, but there's a lack of engagement.
Yeah.
It's just, I haven't decided yet if that's important or not for me. What do you guys think about that? Good.
Back in the day, when I edited a paper publication, we did do reader surveys, and those were very helpful. We surveyed just a fixed percentage of the readership every month, and we asked a set of questions that allowed us to judge what they really liked in the issue we just put out. And that helped us judge what we should and shouldn't do stories about in the future. And it was really useful. But the letters, just as the young man over here said, I think there's an eternal verity in publishing that pissed off people write letters. Happy people may clip the article, share the link, send it to their mother, promote it to all their friends, and you may never know.
Yeah.
So there's that role in customer service where a happy person, someone who liked their service, will tell 2 to 3 of their friends. How many people will someone who's angry, how many people would they tell? They would tell every person they've ever met. They would tell the guy in the subway. They would tell the guy in the gas station how much your service is horrible. So
It's platform independent.
yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that. My mother's a dentist, and she's at the end of her career, and the number of times she gets thanked is quite small. So for her, the main metric is that they keep showing up. So that's a sign of success. But with metrics, there's a risk of if I think that you need metrics, but if you drive to the metric, then you're catering to this very small subject. I mean, if you optimize your blog for hits versus if you optimize it for comments versus you optimize it, then you may lose, first of all, the big hidden majority who's your audience. And so, I mean, I guess the flip question for when you're measuring is how do you act on it?
Or what's the goal?
Yeah.
You know, because not everybody has to have the same goal.
Well, we were talking earlier about the great phenomenon that it seems that the more time and thought you put into your blog post, the less popular it is.
That's very universal. Yes.
I mean, I think, I know that you guys have noticed that there is a phenomenon that I follow a lot of bloggers on Twitter, and that people are much more likely to comment on Twitter or on Facebook about something they've written than they are on the actual site. And I think, possibly some of the reasons for that is that on Twitter it just kind of goes away. Whereas if they comment on your blog, it's kind of there forever, and then people are free to attack them if they don't agree with your comment. So I think it's just a way of people are kind of protecting themselves online almost, because some comment sections get extremely vitriolic.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's an interesting phenomenon because I think people are more apt to comment on social media because they've crafted that list. It's people that they chose to follow or be around, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, G+. So they feel more comfortable commenting in that forum. So there's a level of comfort in that and of engagement there. It's kind of hard to pull all those streams together. Jean?
I'm just wondering, why is having comments on your blog so important?
I think that's a traditional view from hold back from way back in the days of the history of blogging, that 3-4 years ago. It was one of the only metrics. It wasn't Twitter. There wasn't.
Had comments.
But I mean, does it really matter if someone does or does not comment on your blog post if they've read it and are talking about it elsewhere? I mean, it seems more. I mean, sometimes I see a comment, whatever. It may be great to spur discussion, but usually 2 points on comments. The first point is the commenters are generally someone who have a very strong view on either end, right?
Yeah.
I write a lot about vaccines. I get people that are like gung ho vaccines, and I get what are you talking about? Don't put that poison in your baby's body. But then on another note, it's also sort of, if you get more comments and you're so concerned about comments, it's also kind of like an ego thing, right? So, I mean, what is...
Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say on the comment thing, I think part of it is going to depend on your writing style and what your goal is. Maybe it's not, if you're trying to share, this is what my research is, and just inform people, and maybe comments are not important. If you're actually asking questions of people and actively want their input, that's a very different thing, and I think where the comments can be really, it's almost like an extension of the last session here on citizen science. Don't do citizen science, don't worry about the comments if you don't actually want people's feedback and input, but if you really want to know not just, hey, what do you think about this blog post, or what do you think about this science, but, what is your experience with X, Y, or Z, and to then somehow use that, then I think that that's where it comes.
No, that's really a good point. I just wanted to briefly mention, maybe we should have a better discussion of goals when for our blogs or newspapers or whatever. Yeah.
So I just ran some numbers on our site, and there were two stories published the same week. In one case, the percentage of readers who left comments was 0.025. In another, it was 3%.
Wow.
And the difference in the 3% one is the readers started arguing among themselves. And the one that had far fewer comments got about 4 times the page views of the other. So
it's interesting. So there's no correlation between really engagement and
so when you're looking at comments, you have to think a bit about what comments are you seeing and what does that tell
quality of the comments, the commenters.
and are the comments that are actually relevant to the original post.
So the comments already does, and so do these goals define your audience of how, because we had the last session, we were in science literacy. You know, is your goal to make the sort of anybody who reads more literate in science? Is it to get people excited about science and technology? Is it to make money from Google Ads? You know, whatever your goals are. Yeah.
Speaking on your goals idea, I work for Duke, and I use a blog as an internal communications tool to just share information with faculty and staff in the department. And I think I've had 3 comments over the course of the entire blog because people aren't engaging that way. They're using it to get their information. I'm hoping they're using it to get their information. I can measure that. But otherwise, the engagement happens elsewhere. We've surveyed them to see, how they like to get their information. They still read email, but the blog is really useful because it can just kind of file all of this information and people can use it as a resource. But would I care if people commented? It's really, the only comments come if somebody's congratulating somebody else or something's wrong, and then I can address it that way. But I think there are instances, and I know that this is kind of a rarity, I think there are instances where engagement really doesn't matter in this sense. I just need the information to be useful.
So like engagement doesn't define your audience. Yeah.
One thing I think might be worth considering is when they comment on your blog, you're offering them no social capital whatsoever. Maybe they want to interact with you because they want to become part of your community. And if you're trying to drive them to the blog, the likelihood they've become part of your community is less than if they comment on Twitter or Facebook or Google+, where they have the potential of interacting with more people.
Right. So community effect.
Yes.
Twitter is more of an or Twitter or Facebook or social media is more of an ongoing conversation, I feel at least, where if you make a comment, other people are more likely to see that, whereas if you comment on a blog post after other people have already read it, you're not really going to get feedback except from the author, whereas you might want feedback from more people in your community and theirs.
I've noticed on a lot of sites that, especially commercial sites, that you have to be registered in order to comment, and that's just, for me, immediately that's just, okay, it's not worth it.
Yeah, it's like, that's almost telling your audience that you don't really care about their opinion.
Right, so if there's a barrier to commenting, it would be even less useful than any kind of statistics that you might get.
And also, people are probably reading most of their stuff on their mobile phone, so commenting and going through that type of process.
That's a good,
It changes a lot.
There's 2 interesting things about mobile. So, as we know, the world is moving towards tablets and phones and things like that. But also, there's an issue of bandwidth as a limiting factor in your audiences as well. Because if people can't access your content quickly in a way to download the data, to read whatever, you write, so then people are going to skip it. And you don't want people to skip what you're writing. So we're missing I think you have the potential to miss a rather large chunk of an audience. Say people that can't afford mobile phones and tablets, and people that maybe live in developing countries where bandwidth is very limited or costly.
Not even developing countries, but Appalachia, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, a lot of areas still don't have anything like that a lot. And if you are in a beautifully designed, picture-rich site, Scientific American, which is gorgeous, it doesn't load very well on those rural computers. It really doesn't. I've tried.
And people, 56% of DC News' traffic came from dial-up in the last week. I shit you not, came from dial-up. People are still using a phone connection somewhere, and like I think
that was mainly from us though.
Oh yeah,
it's all I can afford. As an independent blog.
Exactly. But yeah, so there's that factor of losing people by just not being accessible.
Is that rural communities with the dial-up, you think? I know North Carolina undoubtedly is.
It is a lot of the less population dense areas have not made the infrastructural change. It's not worthwhile to most companies to actually bring a high-speed internet into that area unless they have some sort of government funding. Let's not get into politics, but it's true. It's one of the big problems with trying to do online outreach from an institutional standpoint. If you have a mandate to serve underrepresented communities, you have two communities you're serving. You're serving the inner city children who generally have phones, so they're accessing the internet, and you're serving the rural community, which generally has dial-up internet, but aren't going to have a mobile phone access at all. So it's two different groups.
But even that still has trouble, which gets us into, and we haven't talked about it, but net neutrality, like that really matters. At least in some big cities, there have been these efforts to, protect that and have, free Wi-Fi. And you still don't have really good, internet accessibility because towers are crappy. Or people on crappy phones. Cricket. Don't even get me started on cricket phone. Cricket phone. You don't know about the cricket phone? That's a whole different conversation.
It's like a trap phone.
It's like a trap phone? Yes. Yes, it's the trap phone of the hood. But it's the same crap. It's crappy.
Yeah. But it's also a very important tool to a lot of the particular kids.
Danny, did you have a comment?
No, but I'll in the same direction since I'm sitting here. I mentioned this in the previous session, but in terms of audience, I'd like to see, and I don't know what the next wave is going to be after now there's blog networks and publications have blogs, and so if you're in another session, I said this before, but it's still hard to push kind of content out. It's like, and since we're talking about metrics, there's kind of a pressure to optimize for your own current audience. But what happens if you want to write for a different audience? I don't think there's a good system right now. Blog networks are good because it's kind of an aggregate, but often still people are only looking at one blog within the blog network. And then I'd love to see some future system. I don't know if it would be done with tagging or how it would work, so that you could write for a type of article that you think would be very helpful for high school teachers to use with their class. So you could write something that would go toward the popular culture.
This is what I call a pluralistic view of communication. And I've been kind of arguing this for a couple of years. And
but a better system than just hoping it'll get picked up or getting a blog, guessing.
Well, I think you have to look at yourself as the writer and say, where do I want to target stuff? For me personally, I really want to serve underrepresented communities, minorities, and that's the one thing I feel like I'm not doing a good job of. And so some of the strategy is to actually get yourself away from your own blog. Deep Sea News is not serving minority communities, so but maybe I can do that better by writing for a different publication, or freelancing an article, or doing something else, and where they do read, whatever that is. So maybe we need more science communication into non-science areas. That's because those are the people we're not really reaching as a group. I mean, certainly there's great examples of people. I think there's even a session later on today about writing for non-traditional science magazines or something like that.
And then there's projects like David Westcott's Science Bomb Project, which is an interesting form of outreach. Have I mentioned I can't see past the cursor? It's an interesting form of outreach. It's an interesting way of getting your content into another area. Or what my museum was doing, we were actually working with the Boy Scouts to get into some of the lower, the schools that don't have funding to come to the museums. They do have active scouting programs, whether it's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, what have you. And those organizations are willing to work with us to get our content in front of the children. So that's offline.
And I think that goes along with pluralistic views. It's so easy to be online and just to write something and put it out there and tweet it, G+ it, and all that kind of stuff. That's the easy way out if you really think about it. The hardest thing to do is actually engage people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in real life or in non-traditional areas. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, just, I teach at the University of Georgia. We're in Athens, Georgia. 30% of our population lives under the poverty line.
Yeah.
My colleagues and I surveyed 300 people in the waiting rooms of free health clinics in the community about technology use. And we found that about 80% of people poor enough that they're sitting in the waiting room of a free clinic have access to the internet, but it may not be in their own home. It may be at the library. And this access may be intermittent because they can't afford it. If they miss a payment that month, they lose the access. A lot of that access probably is dial-up. Phones are really, really interesting. What you raised, the point of the monthly cheap cricket type of phones. Exactly, and this is why a lot of public health interventions rely on text messaging. You know, not on applications that you get on your iPhone or your Droid, because people may have those phones, but again, their access may be intermittent. And if you're doing something like a pregnancy health maintenance program or a medication reminder program, you're probably using texting if you're trying to reach more diverse audiences.
Yeah. And texting is actually a huge form of communication among people, especially younger people as well. Another demographic we often miss in science writing. Charles, did you have a comment?
Well, so when it comes to, I mean, reaching out to these communities, I mean, like the underprivileged communities that you want to reach, or any community that we'd like to target. I mean, are there best practices, or I mean, are there, kind of communities among bloggers that talk about how to reach these communities?
Well, actually, I have a layer on question, and is that better done through an intermediary? Like, do you want to write something that someone else is going to work with their community, or are you hoping that the underserved community is itself surfing your blog?
I mean, are there exemplars that you think of as that person really gets it? I want to do what that person is doing.
That's a good question. Does anybody have any examples that they really like? Yeah, David?
There are two examples. One, I mean, you asked the question, how many people in this room spend a lot of time immersed in a community for which they do not feel they are a member? Seriously, I mean, how many people spend a lot of time in a community where they don't feel like they're a part of it?
Well, that's it.
Okay.
Rural.
So you're doing it. And you're learning it. The other thing is, like you're saying, is I call them bridge figures. Does everybody know what Ethan Zuckerman is? He's the guy who founded Global Voices Online.
No. Global Voices.
Global Voices Online is a global aggregator of content of bloggers all over the world. And Ethan is a guy who's at the Berkman Center at Harvard for a long time. And he, with Rebecca McKinnon, founded this site called Global Voices Online. And he tries to do this. He fights against this force called monopoly. It's the tendency of birds of a feather to flock together. And what he tries to do is find bridge figures who can step foot in more than one community. The example he always uses is Paul Simon and the Bracelet Album, which is kind of funny. But when he was doing the tour with Lady Smith, Black Mambazo in South American music, he became this bridge figure to bring cultures together and everything. I don't know if it's the best example, but really it's just about either going into communities all the time and getting your ass kicked by saying things that are completely wrong for that community, which I do for a living, or finding people who are courageous enough to be those bridge figures, and that's what Simon is all about.
You want to piggyback on?
Yeah, because I mean that's actually a term I use to describe my blogging style, is that I'm a bridge blogger, and I don't advocate people throwing themselves into the fire. I don't think people should necessarily intend on becoming martyrs for their science outreach. One, because it's just a flavor, and it doesn't increase your cultural fitness at all. Because if what you're really trying to do is create, new disciples, it doesn't really help you. It's really risky, and you're never there to see if it really works. I say use those inherent bridges for you. So, for example, I blog. I focus on talking to African American audiences and inner city audiences because that's what I am. It's not a hard stretch for me.
So how do we find more bridges?
I say no. I propose people already have bridges. You need to just acknowledge what those are. So bridges I use is that I belong to at least aggregate in African American blogs. I go to the Blogging While Brown conference, which is the largest, blogging conference of people of color. When I have the time, I at least try to go to other conferences where I have, in other words, those affinity groups that you already belong to. I think there's also some really interesting work being done by by people of faith who are also scientists. That's a natural bridge. You speak the vernacular of faith and science. Who better to comprehend and to explain to both audiences the lack of conflict between those two audiences? So find what you already are passionate about, those communities you already belong to, and start talking to them. Start, talking about what you do to all of them.
Great comments. Yeah. And Josh, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the example of you want to write something for teachers. It's not enough to say I think this would be a good information for teachers to have. Or I think this would be useful information for moms or for one community or another. Like, that intent is a good start, but somehow or other you have to actually make sure that it works for that group. Which can be an informal, if you have that bridge figure that you know that you can reach out to. It's not just saying, can you help me promote this, but can you look this over? Does this work? Does this work for you?
Like crafting content. Yeah.
I mean, it can be a very informal focus group. It doesn't have to be formal surveys and a really formal plan if you're a blogger and you don't have a PR budget. But you can informally get that sort of feedback and figure out what are the sticking points, what are the things that are going to connect with this audience, what are the things what's jargon that might turn people off. What's a way of phrasing things that you don't even realize it, but wow, that word is not
and finding the narrative that fits with that community. Yeah.
My name is Boris Giles. I believe that whenever you're in a setting that you're not comfortable with or you may not know much about, I believe that it's just understanding the culture and having understanding for the people. And with being in a minority setting or urban inner city setting, when you're trying to teach something, I think you have to know that we like cool. We like things that are cool. And so for teachers, if you understand the cool, you understand like their students and the people you give information across to. You understand them, you're able to have a connection. Once you have that connection, you can push anything, like, oh wow, it's cool. That's it.
Yeah. That's why we are working with scouting organizations. They don't always align perfectly ideologically with the Natural History Museum, but it's we actually started working with the 18-year-old Eagle Scouts who need to do mentoring. So we're working with those. I'm not in this project anymore, but we were working with those boys and teaching them how to teach the younger kids. So not so much creating a bridge figure, but using these kids who have an interest and who might be able to influence some of the younger kids in their community.
So just to piggyback a question for you, is there anything worse than someone trying to be cool and failing?
There is something worse.
Is a valiant effort good enough?
I think that's
cool is its own unique style. Like, we're cool, like science, we're like Bob, and we're married to we're cool with that. And I think when you're cool, it's unapologetic. And when I say unapologetic, is that
I get
life, this is what I love. And so, like, there's no wrong way to be cool. Just don't try to force it on someone, And say if you're new to an environment or something, you can't just say, oh, yeah, and like, no, it's not right.
You can't just be like, I hear black people like rap music, so I'm going to put rap music in my blog post.
One thing that I've tried sometimes when writing a post that might be for a more specific audience that is not necessarily my usual audience is use social media, identify not necessarily bridge figures, but the influentials in that other target audience, contact them and just, unapologetically say, hey, I've got this blog post. I would love for your audience to see it. Would you retweet it? Would you post it on Facebook for that matter? Would you repost it with an intro from you that might help be that bridge to say, hey, look.
It's not emphasized enough.
This is cool information. Create those bridges for me that I can't create because I'm not part of this community. And help get this in front of other people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I cannot emphasize, whenever I meet a new blogger and they're frustrated by how things are going on, I say, well, if you got something that's up my alley, let me know, and I'll let the right people know. It's very important. Yeah.
I think another way of creating bridges or being a bridge or finding bridges is to actually start, and this kind of gets into citizen science and it gets into outreach, but if you find ways of incorporating high school students or middle school students into your research, or at least going into their schools and incorporating them in that process. I've just never had any difficulty going into any sort of underserved inner city school, and I have like 2 years of experience doing it.
Kids are sponges, and they want to pick up whatever you have to tell them, as long as you're not actively irritating them. If you have something that they can grab onto and say, okay, this person's kind of like me in some way, whether it's your weird sense of humor or the fact you like Star Wars, or you look the same as them or dress the same as them. Kids want to learn. Kids are natural bridge figures.
Yeah. I think that's you have a comment?
One of the things that came up in a session yesterday is using another language also. I mean, a lot of us, we have a huge advantage. Most of the people at this conference are native speakers of English, which is giving us a big leg up, but it doesn't mean that that's your whole potential audience. And a couple of people yesterday mentioned that they had had opportunities in journalism just because they spoke another language. So if you do, why not put your content out there in more than one language, or reach out to somebody who can put it in another language for you, and you can get to the right audience that way. I mean, I've come across some of my stuff that's been translated and put on, other people's blogs, but it's, if you're actually, trying to do that, you can maybe have a little more control over it. And we can all reach out to people internationally by social media.
No, I think that, and the interesting thing about social media is there's some really interesting research on this. I think I might have included it here, one of these things, Ignite. I think it's the Ignite report. It breaks down what the audience of each platform is. And kids are not using the same things that 30-year-olds are using. And Americans are not using the same things Italians are using in terms of platforms and sharing. So it's an interesting thing. For us, the 3 big ones are always Facebook, Twitter, Google+. I think within our community, more or less. And so you're only reaching people that are actually using those platforms. And you don't go beyond that. You're constrained by that. And I don't know, there's not a really a good answer to it. You just have to recognize, I think, that that's your limitation in reaching audiences. Because there's not like a hyper platform that will just broadcast things out to everything, Like young kids are using something called Vivo, which I have no idea what it is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. and so that's what they're using. That's what that demographic is using. And then old people are using Facebook and LinkedIn.
And say LiveJournal actually has a huge Asian, Eastern European population who like that particular platform for because it was less. I forget what the original reason was, but for some reason, LiveJournal is still one of the big social media platforms in Eastern Europe.
Fairly less censored.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah.
So in terms of, I guess, this birds of a feather kind of tend to flock together, at the last Sonnet, where you were a panelist, Ben Lilly actually raised his hand and suggested, why not try to get sort of guest bloggers on your site, but not guest bloggers that are scientists. He said potentially get someone who writes about fashion, and then have them write about fashion, and then perhaps complement that with some sort of science of fashion, if that even exists. So I mean, there are ways that you can use your blog to reach outside of your niche.
Yeah, and I think David Westcott's example of Simon has been one of the model example in my recent memory of really bridging audiences.
I know a really good fashion blogger.
Yeah.
This idea of finding alternative portals is sort of a discussion that's really prevalent in the journalism community, and there have been some really great recent examples. Carl Zimmer's profile of Neil deGrasse Tyson in Playboy, and then Mary McKenna, who's in here, does, I think, a lot of writing for women's magazines. And I think that one thing that we often forget as people who are sort of science-focused, science nerds, that's the interest, is you want to cover the breaking science or whatever's the new development in your field. And you forget that you have lots of hats. I'm a huge gamer nerd. That's sort of like a hobby.
Yeah.
There's a lot of science around gaming that you could cover.
I started doing
things
this
that you
with
do as
drinking.
hobbies.
I write about it in cocktail magazines. Started writing about the science of drinking and ingredients. And I craft evolution into why bitters are bitter. Things like that. So
But the point is that there are a lot of publications in the world that aren't science publications that would take science stories about their topic.
Yeah.
Because Ed Young has a great example that he likes to throw around of a ballet article that he wrote that blossomed within the ballet community because it was the science of ballet. About if there's like a ballet trade magazine, they would want that.
Yesterday when I was tweeting the uses of the past session, I actually, because my area of science is more in the historical field, I actually follow a lot of history bloggers who are not in any way connected with the science blogging community. And they are always talking to me going, are you guys really talking about that? Like, you didn't follow our last discussion? So I think there's a lot of atomization between these different communities. Maybe a ballet magazine would love to have science pieces. Maybe a history blog network would love to see some more sciencey people addressing historical topics. Or could we invite more history-oriented people to address our topics?
I think a lot of that is, people need to start getting out of their comfort zone more. Is what it comes down to. If you want to just go beyond just having a paycheck and getting to really get down to the philosophical underpinnings of why you do what you do.
I think two of you have just put the finger on something very important that all of us are forgetting that we are more and more talking to specialized audiences. And this conference is an example of that. We are all tweeting and blogging, and people who will read that are people who are already passionate about that. But sometimes there's people in history of science who discover, there's a community talking about that, and they find that interesting, but in their own universe, they're talking about that since years probably. And unfortunately, we are forgetting that in this universe, there is a danger of talking more and more to people already interested in the subject.
We call that the echo chamber.
Yeah.
And or the somebody else said right. I saw it. Yes.
There have been a lot of really interesting collaborations between art and science that I've been seeing, especially over the last year. There was this one artist, I can't remember her name, but she went up to she went to Antarctica, and she recorded the sounds of glaciers calving underwater, and I've seen just wonderful installations where artists take visualizations of science and they're presenting scientific work to a completely new audience, and I think that's a really interesting direction for things to go in.
Yeah, there's some great examples in the UK. I can't remember the name of the project, but they take out artists on like sailing vessels in the Arctic. And they all sorts of different types of art, and there was one guy that did projections on glaciers and things like that. And they took out a British pop musician. I don't know what her name is, but apparently people there do. And so I think these collaborations do help a lot. I don't know what the evidence of that is, though. I mean, that's what we have to think about. If we want to pinpoint what works and what doesn't work. What's the evidence of that really working?
Slight shameless plug, but related. I have an article coming out next month in Guru about the Science Gallery, which is based in Dublin, which is basically it's not really an art gallery, it's a gallery of science, but it's not a science center in the usual way where, you have a lot of, they don't have any permanent exhibits. So they just, they put out a call for exhibits for each particular theme that they do. And they've actually had really tremendous success in reaching an audience of teens and young adults, which is basically kind of the whole audience that most science centers miss, because they attract young children or they attract people who are really interested seriously in science.
Do you have to know about the teens and young adults?
Well, they're in a university setting, so, you know, I mean, I'm sure that it is part of it, but, I mean, they've just received a grant from Google to start a worldwide network of science galleries. So this idea of, you know, using the bridge with art, and it's not only art, but just a lot of, you know, visual input, and they do have, you know, hands-on science. That's another great thing that's
So we're talking a lot about building bridges, and that's great, and it's something that I personally want to do. But once I start and going to build that bridge to do, say, maybe, so I write about chemistry, so maybe I want to build a bridge away from chemistry. But once I do that, I've fundamentally changed my audience. Do you guys know of any examples or any people who do a really good job of building this bridge and still have that way to talk to their community, right? So if I want to still bring up things that are very relevant to my personal work community or professional community, but still have a bridge and not disenfranchise either one in doing that. And it seems to me that's somewhat a conflict.
That's a very interesting problem, because if you start to reach out to some different type of segment of audience, you might lose the one you've already established. And so, I mean, one way of getting around that is to have separate platforms, you know, where you reach these communities. I don't know if that's the answer, John?
So in chemistry, actually, Derek Lowe bridges the pharmaceutical industry, hardcore chemistry, and is just really funny and gets an audience.
And David does a great job, and he's got his two blogs to sort of hit at whatever topic he wants to. Is that something that's necessary? Like, Kevin said, maybe you need the two platforms to do that. Does anyone try to do it on a single platform and combine it?
I've tried, and mostly for me, it's just been a motivation kind of factor to keep it up. You know, I have two blogs. A blog at Scientific American about evolutionary ecology, and then I blog at Deep Sea News about anything related to the ocean. So I separate that content out, but that's mostly for my own personal interests. It's not a strategy. Really. So, yeah.
I can't claim that I've had a ton of success with it, but I'll share my thoughts on that, which is trying to, you know, part of the point of, at least for me, of building a bridge and getting something out to another audience is not just so that more people see my byline, but it would be to foster discussion between different groups. And so it's kind of like we've come full circle. What's the point of comments? Maybe the point is that if you can get some of those new people onto the blog, and you know, maybe you've got to just start throwing out questions. You can't just put up a post and hope people will do it on their own. Maybe you've really got to jumpstart it and, you know, say, hey, you know, maybe it's specifically a blog post explaining to your previous community, hey, look, I'm trying to reach out to a new community. We're getting some new readers. Can you guys be welcoming and let's talk about some of this, and then making some of those comments and some of that discussion actually a thread on the blog, so that interaction between communities becomes content itself, and a way for those two communities to maybe not merge, but to start to relate to each other and not feel so alienated and separate.
You had a comment in the back.
As an organization, we have various audiences that we have to reach and bridge across, including the general public, government, other scientists, and we use separate platforms. We build the plumbing underneath, so that when we have two newsletters, we have...
What's your organization, sorry?
Genome Alberta. We're a genetics funding organization in Canada. So we have essentially two blogs, two very distinct websites, two Twitter feeds, and two bi-weekly newsletters, and I do it all. I'm the only one. But the plumbing we've built underneath feeds across. So if I see something that I want to post, or that I've written, or that a guest blogger has written, I can say, okay, I want it to go here and here. Or if it's a piece of original content in the newsletter, it feeds out automatically to one of the RSS feeds of the blog. So we built the technology plumbing underneath so that we can write one piece and reuse it in 3 or 4 different places, and we can choose those different places. It doesn't just kind of go as a broadcast out. So to reach and build those bridges, and to go back to the comment about are you disenfranchising somebody or how do you split your personality?
Yeah.
We have a couple of very distinct personalities, but we build it all around common content wherever possible.
Interesting. That's a interesting approach.
That brings me on to something to what I wanted to ask, which is, so I work for the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and what we're trying to do with our website over the next year is to try and investigate and build up an idea of sort of the audience via kind of personas, who are actually the sort of ideal, well, not ideal figures, but kind of almost a microcosm of perhaps different groups who are logging in using whether they be grant holders or interested public or whatever. I just wondered if anybody had had any experience and success of that approach and perhaps tools they've used or anything like that.
Are you thinking of asking people to self-identify when they come into the site?
Well, possibly. And I mean, one of the things I'd be really interested in is whether there are any kind of, I mean, you can obviously ask people and you can do surveys, as Kevin was saying at the outset, but are there actually any clever automated metric tools through which you can maybe try and get a grip on that?
I don't know how clever it is, but John Hawkes had a session, I think it was last year or the year before, and it had really to do with justifying your online outreach to like your tenure community.
Right. Yeah.
But he had a really good comment about how he found out like how the type of people he was reaching by looking at just the hits and the IP addresses and the communities that were associated. So you can go to your IP address and tell you, what zip code essentially that person was from, and you go in there and you find the social metrics, for that. So you can see is this a low salary, high salary environments, is this inner city, is this suburbia, those kinds of things, and see, and you can get a proportion sort of, and it's a very rough method.
I guess you can do a lot to work out how many of your IP addresses are at universities as well.
I do this actually. When I was justifying it to my advisor when I was a graduate student, I said, "Look, I'm reaching all these. I'm reaching all these people in universities all over the world." And of course, he said, "Oh, I don't care. Just not doing the research."
I will say, just to add to your point, I work at the Northeast Medical Institute.
Oh, okay. Right.
We suffer from the same problem all the time. We've tried a variety of metrics tools, Google Analytics, Omniture, Drug Trends, to get at this, and have found that nothing gives us the kind of information that we can get in surveys. So, I think it's probably...
You also have to recognize those surveys are self-selected because there are people that are interested enough to answer. The information...
Well, we actually do 2 kinds of surveys. So we do the kind where people who are at the website already, who are interested enough to fulfill the survey, and then we also send out email blasts and give people an incentive. So we do the Amazon gift certificate, and we get different information, and we sort of try to aggregate it together.
Yeah, I usually give away books from my library. Usually I did a Science Online app.
I just wanted to let folks know, we're talking a lot about outreach. I'm going to try some outreach outside around lunch today. Gene was talking about it. I had it backwards. I got my video camera, and anybody who's interested, I'm going to be in the lobby somewhere. I got to find a place where the sound and the light works. Get on camera, tell me who you are, your name, where you write, what you do, and then finish the sentence. Science is. And I'm going to put together a montage of that, and then we're going to push it out to communities that are not scientists. And your challenge will be, once it's done, to share the video with 2 people who are not scientists. And whatever community you think makes sense. And my goal for that is to do 2 things. 1, encourage people like you to be better ambassadors or more engaged in science communication and outreach. The process of getting people more comfortable with outreach. And 2, finding people who are going to run with this. Engaging people who see the video and say, that person looks like me, that person sounds like me. reach out to young people. So if you're interested in doing that, I'm going to set up somewhere in the lobby on the guy who looks like me. We'll just do it, and then we'll push it out. We did something earlier with, Kevin was involved with it, producing where people were trying to answer the same question that the Miss USA contestants had. Should evolution be taught in schools? And the Miss USA people were not that great. But we got a bunch of women scientists like Jean to answer the same question, and they killed it. And so, that got out on the Jezebel, it got out on the feminist philosophers and other communities, and people started talking about it. And that's what we're going to try to do with this. So if you're interested, it'll be a minute and a half of your time. Come out and just have the courage to say what science is and be, courageous about it. And don't just say science is, the process. I mean, that's fine too, but if you could say something that engages people, and if you really want to tell people who don't see what you see every day and explain it to them, then we'll do what we do and spread it out to the people who matter. And just to try to keep it that simple, because that's where you start.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Further to your comment about how you do the analytics for your communities, I have yet to come across kind of a single all-encompassing tool. But again, what we built underneath, like we aggregate a lot of news because we can't generate enough ourselves, so we aggregate other people's news. And the analytics we built allow us to see, based on self-identification to a certain extent, as long as you're a registered user, and based on some IP addresses so we can track geography, we can see who is reading a certain story. So if I post a story on stem cells, doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it's from Nature or whatever, if I kind of post that headline and link to the story, I can tell when they come to our site basically who they are fairly closely, because all the plumbing is essentially built on Facebook. It's not a Facebook site, but if you look at it, it's all built on Facebook embedded. So we have all those analytics at our disposal, and we essentially stole from the ideas from the marketing and sales community, so that when our newsletters go out, and it's got the little pixel in there so we can see who's opened it and who's not. So again, we can look at the newsletters and say, okay, this newsletter had certain content. Did more people open it, or did fewer people open it? So we can tell quite closely how well it's working, how it's not. And because it's all integrated, and I know that, okay, this newsletter went out to this mailing list, and this many people opened it, and that same story that was also on our genomics news site also was fairly popular. I can at least get a qualitative, not so much a quantitative entirely, because it's, there always is a crapshoot in there. I can at least look at it and say, okay, I know stem cell tourism stories within our community are going to be a big hit.
Yeah.
And we can figure it out. You're always going to have to design your own tool, your own custom. I don't think there is one that's going to be the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, I mean, different messages just tell you different things, and so you have to just recognize that and use that to your advantage. Like if I really like sharing metrics because it makes me feel like a certain piece, and I do consciously experiment with writing style. That's why I probably look very inconsistent in my writing, but at the same time, I know what is working and what is not working.
You started a third blog. What audience would you target?
It's a kind of anonymous blog. It's my ranting blog. That's a good question, actually. I don't know what it would be. I probably would talk more strategically about communications more. I do that on my Cyan blog a lot, but it's a good question. I have to think about it.
I'm not interested at all in what I blog about myself. I don't have things, so I don't get to stick with things.
I think that's time. But does anybody else have a last comment? All right,
I contribute to a blog called Mad Art Lab, and it sounds like it's accidentally a bridge site. We really just created it saying, hey, let's do art and science. And what has happened is that we're bringing in a lot of people who don't normally read blogs about science. A spectacular example of that was somebody posted an article about armor and the impracticality of it in some online games. We brought in all these LARPers, all these online gamers who never talk about science normally.
Yeah.
And they started reading our other articles. Some of them actually stuck around, so it was really great.
So you got the hook.
Yeah.
The hook to bring them in.
And it was completely accidental.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks a lot, guys, for participating.